Harvard University once took its tuition payments in seashells. In the 1640s, a student arriving in Cambridge, Massachusetts could settle his bill with strings of polished beads drilled from Welkin quahog shells because those beads were legal money in the colony, fixed by statute at a set number of beads to the penny. 20 years later, in 1661, the same colony that had written shell money into law wrote it back out, stripped its legal tender status, and let it die. The people who did the stripping were not reformers cleaning up a failed experiment. They were the owners of the money that came next. That sequence, the new money outlawing the old one the moment it takes the throne, is not a colonial curiosity. It is run at least 4 separate times in American history on a rough cycle of about 70 years, and I would wager that fewer than one American in 100 has ever seen the whole chain laid out end to end. Shell money was killed by coin. Colonial paper was banned by an Act of Parliament in 1764. Thousands of private bank currencies were taxed out of existence by a single sentence passed in 1865. And in 1933, the United States government made it a federal crime, punishable by up to 10 years in prison, for a citizen to own gold. Not stolen gold, not smuggled gold, gold. 3 things in this story I want you to hold on to until we get there. First, one of these bans produced the single largest windfall the United States Treasury had recorded up to that point, and the money it generated is still sitting in a fund that operates today with almost no congressional oversight. Second, a man was convicted in federal court of counterfeiting for minting coins made of real assayed .999 fine silver, and the United States Attorney described his mint in an official press release as a form of domestic terrorism. And third, exactly one of the banned monies in this story ever came back from the dead, and the date of its resurrection tells you more about where cryptocurrency sits right now than any prediction ever could. Here is exactly what this video will walk through. First, the full story of wampum, the shell currency that a colonial government adopted, ran, debased, and then executed in 1661, including the mint that replaced it, which was itself illegal under English law. Second, the Currency Act of 1764, the law by which Britain banned America's paper money, and the testimony Benjamin Franklin gave to Parliament naming that ban as a cause of the coming revolution. Third, the 2 sentences Congress passed on March 3, 1865, a 10% tax that erased thousands of distinct private currencies and shrank the number of note-issuing state banks from roughly 1,500 to fewer than 300 in about 3 years, according to the Comptroller of the Currency's own reports. Fourth, Executive Order 6102, the 1933 gold ban, and the New York lawyer named Fredra. A quick word on method, because this channel earns its claims the same way every episode. Everything dated here comes from the primary record, colonial statute books, the text of the Currency Act, the Congressional Session Laws of 1865, the published text of Executive Order 6102, federal court records, and the Treasury's own annual reports. Where historians disagree, or the numbers are estimates, I will say so out loud. Start on the water. Before Europeans arrived, the peoples of the Long Island Sound region, the Narragansett, the Pequot, and their neighbors produced wampum, cylindrical beads ground from the white inner spiral of the whelk shell and the purple heart of the quahog clam. Each bead took real labor, cutting, drilling with stone tools, polishing, stringing. That labor cost is what made wampum work as money. You could not conjure it, you had to make it. And making it was slow, and everyone along the coast knew roughly how slow. The purple beads, harder to produce, carried roughly twice the value of the white, a 2-tier denomination system that existed before any colonist wrote anything down. The Dutch at New Amsterdam grasped this first and used wampum to run the fur trade. The English colonies followed because they had a problem wampum solved. There was almost no English coin in New England. Silver flowed east across the Atlantic to pay for imports and did not come back. A colony with no coin cannot collect taxes, pay soldiers, or settle debts. So in 1637, the Massachusetts Bay Colony did something remarkable. It made wampum legal tender by statute, at first for small sums, and colonial law fixed the exchange rate in beads to the penny. For about 2 decades, shell beads were lawful money in Puritan Massachusetts. Court fines were paid in wampum. Harvard, as I said, took it for tuition. This was not a fringe practice. It was the monetary system. Then the system was debased, and here is the detail most retellings skip. The debasement came from the European side. Colonists and Dutch workshops began producing counterfeit and shortcut wampum, beads that were dyed instead of naturally purple, beads drilled fast and rough, and eventually glass imitations. The labor cost that had anchored the currency collapsed. The bead supply swelled, the value per bead fell, and colonial legislatures responded the way legislatures always respond to an inflating currency, by passing quality standards requiring beads to be strung and graded, and adjusting the official rate downward. It did not hold. By the 1650s, wampum was visibly losing the confidence of the people using it. And here the story turns, because Massachusetts did not simply let wampum fade. In 1652, the colony opened its own mint in Boston, run by a silversmith named John Hull, striking the coins collectors now call pine tree shillings. Hull took 1 coin in every 15 as his minting fee, and became, by most accounts, one of the richest men in the colony. 9 years later, in 1661, with its own silver coins circulating, Massachusetts ended wampum's legal tender status. The old money was not outlawed for failing in the abstract. It was demonetized at the precise moment its replacement was ready. And savor this, the pine tree shilling, the successor that killed shell money, was itself illegal. Under English law, minting coin was a royal prerogative, and no colony had the right to strike its own. Massachusetts dodged the issue for decades, partly by freezing the date 1652 on every coin regardless of when it was actually struck, until the Crown shut the mint down in the 1680s and revoked the colony's charter shortly after. The money that banned wampum was banned in its turn. The cycle had completed its first full American rotation before the United States existed. So let me name the mechanism plainly, because once you see its shape, you will recognize it in every era that follows. The incumbent-bans-the-successor cycle runs in 3 stages. Stage 1 is coexistence. A new form of money appears and circulates alongside the established one, usually because the established one is scarce, inconvenient, or failing at some job people need done. Stage 2 is competition. The new money starts winning real transaction volume, and the institution that profits from the old money, a crown, a parliament, a treasury, a banking system, begins to lose something economists call seigniorage. The built-in profit that flows to whoever issues the money everyone else must use. Stage 3 is criminalization, and it has a signature. The ban is almost never worded as a ban. It arrives dressed as something administrative. A tender regulation, a tax, a licensing requirement, an emergency measure against hoarding. The stated purpose is always protection of the public. The observable effect, visible in the ledgers every single time, is that the incumbent's revenue and control are restored. And notice what stage 3 implies. The ban does not come when the challenger money is failing. A failing currency needs no law to kill it. Wampum was already dying of debasement, yet the statute still came timed to the mint. The ban comes when the challenger is working well enough to threaten the issuer's income. That is the tell. Across 300 years of American records, governments have banned monies at their moment of maximum usefulness, not their moment of collapse. Keep that in mind, and keep in mind the promise about the Treasury's windfall, because we are heading toward the era where the pattern paid out in cash. Era 2. After wampum and the pine tree shilling, the colonies invented something genuinely new. In 1690, Massachusetts, needing to pay soldiers returning from a failed expedition against Quebec, and having no coin to do it with, printed bills of credit, paper promises that circulated as money. Most monetary historians count these as the first government paper currency in the Western world. Other colonies copied the idea with wildly varying discipline. Rhode Island printed itself into inflation. Pennsylvania, by contrast, ran its paper system carefully for decades. and its most famous defender was a young printer named Benjamin Franklin, who published a pamphlet in 1729 arguing for paper currency and then, with pleasing self-interest, won the contract to print it. Pennsylvania's paper money was, by the accounts of the era, boring in the best sense, stable, accepted, useful. London hated all of it. British merchants wanted debts repaid in sterling, not in colonial paper of fluctuating value, and Parliament answered them twice. The Currency Act of 1751 restricted paper money in New England. The Currency Act of 1764 extended the policy to every colony, prohibiting new legal tender paper outright. The successor money colonial paper era 3, and this one is my favorite because the execution weapon was a tax so small on paper and so absolute in effect that it deserves to be famous. By the 1850s, the United States had no single national currency. Money in your pocket meant privately issued banknotes, paper printed by state-chartered banks, each note a claim on one specific bank's reserves. Per the records of the era, well over 1,000 banks were issuing notes, and the count of distinct note designs in circulation ran into the thousands, so many that merchants subscribed to weekly publications called banknote reporters just to check which notes were sound, which were discounted, and which were worthless. It was chaotic, it was fraud-prone, and it was also unmistakably a functioning competitive currency system that the federal government did not control. The Civil War ended that. Washington needed to finance the war and needed a national banking system to absorb its bonds, so Congress passed the National Banking Acts of 1863 and 1864, creating federally chartered banks issuing uniform national notes. But the state bank notes kept circulating because people were used to them. The incumbent had built its successor system and the old money would not leave the stage. So on March 3, 1865, Congress passed the Instrument of Execution, a 10% tax on any payment made in state banknotes, effective the following year. Not a prohibition. Nobody was arrested for holding a state banknote. The note was simply made 10% more expensive to use than its federal rival, which is another way of saying it was made worthless as money while remaining perfectly legal as paper. The controller of the currencies reports tell the rest. The population of note-issuing state banks collapsed from roughly 1,500 to fewer than 300 within about 3 years. Thousands of distinct American currencies vanished, not with a raid, but with a tax return. One bank fought it to the Supreme Court. In Vesey Bank versus Fenno, decided in 1869, the court upheld the tax as a legitimate exercise of federal power over the currency. And the Chief Justice who presided over that ruling was Salmon P. Chase, the same man who, as Lincoln's Treasury Secretary, had designed the national banking system the tax was protecting and whose own portrait had appeared on the federal government's $1 note. The architect of the incumbent ruled on the legality of the weapon that cleared the field for it. I offer no comment beyond the record. The record grins on its own. Era 4 is where the pattern touched the metal itself and where the promised windfall lands. April 5, 1933. 5 weeks into his presidency, in the pit of the banking crisis, Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 6102, and its text, which you can read today, required every person in the United States to deliver their gold coin, gold bullion, and gold certificates to a Federal Reserve Bank by May 1st in exchange for paper dollars at the official price of $20.67 per ounce. Exemptions were narrow, about $100 in coin per person, rare collector pieces, industrial and dental stock. The penalty for non-compliance ran up to $10,000, a decade's wages for many families at the time, or up to 10 years in federal prison, or both. The order's stated target was hoarding. Read that word again with the mechanism in mind. The oldest money in human history, the incumbent of incumbents, had become the challenger because a government that wants to expand its paper currency cannot tolerate a rival that citizens can redeem into and walk away. Now meet the man who said no. Frederick Barber Campbell was a Manhattan attorney who held roughly 5,000 troy ounces of gold in bars at Chase National Bank. When he tried to withdraw his own property, the bank following the order refused. Campbell sued Chase, and the government answered by indicting Campbell criminally for failing to surrender his gold. The case landed before federal judge John Woolsey, a name you may know for an entirely different reason. Weeks later, that same judge would issue the famous ruling that legalized James Joyce's novel Ulysses in America. Woolsey threw out the charge against Campbell, and the grounds are exquisite. The statute required the president to issue such regulations, and the surrender requirement had been signed by the Secretary of the Treasury instead. A paperwork defect. Campbell walked free. His gold did not walk with him. The bars stayed surrendered to the official price, and court records show he never recovered them as metal. Congress cured the paperwork within weeks. The Gold Reserve Act of January 1934 transferred title to the nation's monetary gold to the Treasury, and then revalued gold from $20.67 to $35 per ounce. Sit with the arithmetic. The government compelled its citizens to hand over gold at one price, and then, holding the gold, declared it worth roughly 69% more. The Treasury's own accounts recorded a book gain of approximately $2.8 billion, the largest single windfall in its history to that date, and about $2 billion of it was placed into a new vehicle called the Exchange Stabilization Fund, a fund that exists to this day under the Treasury Secretary's discretion, outside the ordinary appropriations process. There is your promised ledger entry. The confiscation was not a rounding error of crisis policy. It was on the government's own books, a profit center. So we have 4 rotations of the wheel: shell to coin, paper banned by sterling, private notes taxed to death by national ones, and gold itself criminalized by paper. Now let me give you the 5 signatures of the cycle, stated as rules you can test against the record. And then hold each one up against the present. Signature 1. The ban targets success, not failure. Wampum was demonetized only once the Boston Mint was running. State banknotes were taxed only after they refused to die on their own. Gold was seized precisely because people trusted it more than banks in 1933, not less. When you see a form of money restricted, the restriction itself is evidence that the money was doing its job. Applied to the present, cryptocurrency processed transactions measured in the trillions of dollars over the past decade, and the regulatory attention arrived in proportion to the volume, not in proportion to any collapse. Signature 2. The ban never says ban. Parliament called it a currency regulation. Congress called it a tax. Roosevelt called it an anti-hoarding measure. In the modern era, the vocabulary is licensing, registration, and compliance. New York's byte license regime of 2015 caused a documented exodus of crypto firms from the state, not by prohibiting anything but by pricing participation. In 2023, the Securities and Exchange Commission, per its own public filings, sued the largest exchanges then operating in the United States over registration questions. Whatever you think of the merits, and reasonable people disagree, the form is the historical form, administrative language, prohibitive effect. Signature 3. The stated reason is protection. The measurable effect is revenue and control. Every era's ban was announced as a defense of the public, and every era's ledger shows the issuer's seigniorage restored. This is not an accusation of bad faith against any particular official, past or present. It is an observation that the pattern's stated motives and its financial outcomes have diverged in the same direction 4 times in a row, and a 5th divergence would surprise no one who has read the first 4. Signature 4. The incumbent acquires the challenger's reserves at the old price and reprices afterward. 1933 is the cleanest case. $20.67 in, $35 out. But watch for the softer modern version, when a government moves from fighting an asset to holding it, taxing it, and wrapping it in approved products. The repricing accrues to whoever positioned themselves before the wrapping, which brings me to Signature 5, the strangest one. The cycle never actually kills the challenger, it exiles it, and exile ends one of 2 ways: absorption or return. Private banknotes were absorbed. Their descendants are the deposits in your checking account. And gold, the only outright banned money in this story, returned. On December 31, 1974, after 41 years, it became legal for Americans to own gold again. And on the markets that week, gold traded at roughly $186 an ounce, about 9 times the price at which it had been taken. The ban had not destroyed gold. It had only determined who was allowed to benefit from gold's rise. And for 4 decades, the answer was, not you. As for crypto, the United States has so far chosen the absorption path rather than the prohibition path. Spot exchange-traded funds were approved in 2024, while other governments, notably China in 2021, chose outright bans running stage 3 in its classical form. If the pattern holds, and I say if, because a pattern is not a prophecy, the live question is never whether the new money survives. It is who owns it on the day the incumbent stops fighting and starts collecting. Before I close the story I promised about the silver coins, because it compresses this entire video into one courtroom. Bernard von Nordhaus began minting a private currency called the Liberty Dollar in 1998. Medallions of genuine .999 fine silver, openly advertised as said and, according to the government's own case, circulated in the tens of millions of dollars. In 2007, the FBI raided the operation, and in 2011 a federal jury convicted von Nordhaus under counterfeiting statutes for making coins resembling United States money. The silver was real, the weight was real. The crime, as charged, was resemblance to and competition with the incumbent, and the United States Attorney's press release described the enterprise as a unique form of domestic terrorism. He was ultimately sentenced years later to house arrest and probation, and to be fair to the record, the adjacent case of the digital currency e-gold, whose founder pleaded guilty in 2008 to operating an unlicensed money transmitting business, involved genuine fraud problems on its network, per the Justice Department. So none of this is a claim that private money ventures are saints, but held the Wampum Statute of 1661 in one hand and the von Nordhaus verdict of 2011 in the other, 350 years apart. And tell me they are not the same document. If you take one thing from this hour, take the tell. 1661, 1764, 1866, 1933. 4 times, a money that Americans were actually using was ended not by its own failure, but by the arrival of a successor with the power to legislate, and every time the ban was dressed as protection while the ledger recorded a profit. That is a pattern in the historical record offered for education, not financial advice. What it means for anything you own is a question for you, and for many people, a qualified advisor. But the next time you hear that some form of money must be restricted for your safety, you now know the 4 previous occasions on which that exact sentence was spoken, and what the Treasury's books looked like afterward. The next episode on this channel follows the money from this one. The Exchange Stabilization Fund, the $2 billion skimmed from the 1933 gold seizure.